because we created a medical model of disability that did not affirm who these children were. It was fix it, make it go away, make my life easier. Because if they're normed, then everything's simple. They just follow in. There's no challenge, there's no difficulty. You just get to go about the day. And so I think there is this very big fear if I say my autistic child, oh, this is lifelong and permanent. Oh no. Instead of, oh, this is lifelong and permanent. Yay, that's who you are.
Yeah, sure.
And an acceptance.
I really appreciate you joining us.
Either work or give for
Why is this happening? What does the child need to express themselves?
How can we help understand them? Here's a way to look at autism in which your child is not a problem that needs to be fixed.
That's that shift in language that's so important.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first ever episode of Feeling the Love with Big Heart Toys, our newest podcast series. We are going to be speaking with Christine MacInnis today. She's a licensed family and marriage therapist, and she's going to be talking to us all about autism, neurodiversity, and debunking myths. So let's dive in. All right, so hi, Christine. I'm so happy to have you here with us today. I would love if you could introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure, Taylor, I'd love to.
Yeah.
I'm Christine MacInnis. I'm the owner and practitioner at Transcends Family Therapy. We're a practice that focuses on neurodivergent affirming care and LGBTQ affirming care. And we've grown quite a bit in the past few years and really have kind of honed in on that population of support. And I'm surprised how quickly that's growing in kind of popularity now.
Yeah.
It was something that was kind of our own little niche. And now I feel like so many other practitioners are doing this important work. And it's so exciting to see that.
It is really exciting. And I think your passion, I know we've spoken before, your passion speaks to how important this topic is.
Huge.
So I would love to just start off by asking you a little bit about some of these definitions, and they're big. I know they're big.
And complicated.
They're complicated. There's no perfect answer, right?
Right.
So what is autism?
And I'm going to start off with this whole idea that there is a very stereotyped idea. In fact, if you even say the word, people will come up with their very own picture of a person with autism.
Sure.
And they will actually say with autism, like it's a disability or an issue or a problem. And even our medical model of diagnosing, the DSM, which is a diagnostic manual that therapists and doctors use to diagnose people with disorders, still has it as autism spectrum disorder. We in the movement, the neurodiversity part, I can never say this word.
That's okay.
It's going to come in.
Go ahead.
Paradigm comes up with a whole new understanding of it, that it is not a disorder. It's not necessarily a disabling condition. Parts of it that come along with it can be disabling, but in itself is not necessarily disabling, if that makes sense. It's a series of different types of ways of thinking. It's a neurotype, and we all have different neurotypes. The difference between an autistic person, and we will from here on out refer to them that way, because identity first language about who you are is really important. They experience their world just in a different way than what is neuronormed. And when I say neuronormed, it's what the expectations of society bring.
Yes.
And most of those expectations, we'll note, are to support capitalism and the ongoing flow of work. So if you're capable of providing a work environment on a daily basis, whether you're in school as a child or as an adult in a corporation, you're neuronormed. You meet the expectations. You shake hands. You have eye contact. You have all of these ideas of what is supposed to be the way to behave.
Yes, right.
And what we're challenging now under this neurodiversity movement is there are very different ways of being, and they're all acceptable. you don't have to have eye contact to necessarily reach an audience or to be engaged with a person.
Right.
You don't have to have constant engagement all day long with various groups of people.
Right.
That could be incredibly exhausting to an
Yeah.
autistic person. They're just experiencing their world in very different ways. And those ways of being, you'll hear a lot on the spectrum. While I don't like using that terminology either, because it defines people as better than or less than. So if you're on the spectrum, oh, I'm highly functioning.
Yeah.
Again, even within the community, there is a divide of who's good at being in the system of neuronormed behaviors and who is not. So when I describe being on the spectrum, it's more support level. So someone might be non-speaking and need some sort of support device in order to communicate. Well, I would challenge, in our world now, we all use those devices.
Yeah.
Your phone is
Texting,
never far away from
exactly,
you.
yeah.
So you're constantly
Yeah.
doing that anyway.
Right.
But if you were talking about somebody who wasn't speaking traditionally and uses a device to communicate, there's something quote unquote wrong with that.
Right.
That's what we're challenging, that there's not. That everybody gets to show up as who they are. In even corporations and environments where people do their work are starting to catch on that autistic employees are actually incredible, because we have this thing called hyperfocus. And when we're really excited about something, like you'll hear me talk about this, we can't stop doing it.
Yeah. So what is hyperfocus?
Hyperfocus is when you really are excited and interested in a topic.
Yep.
And it becomes your whole world. This is my hyperfocus right now. And I really
Yeah.
live it, breathe it.
Yeah.
You know, some people go to their daily job. I go to my daily job all day long.
And you get to do this.
I get to do this. I get to be at a dinner party and have a young parent saying, I'm really worried about my child. You know, they're not making eye contact. The teacher says they're talking differently than their peers. There's something quote unquote wrong with them. And I get to sit down with them and talk to them about it and normalize it and calm down their nerves a bit, that it sounds like their child's just has a neurotype that's different.
Yeah. So I'm so interested in hearing about how would that conversation look if a parent, you know, they're saying, oh, you know, teacher's saying something's wrong with my child, or, you know, I'm having this anxiety about what's going on. How do you broach that conversation to normalize the situation?
I generally ask, what are the concerns?
Yeah.
What are you thinking as a
Yeah.
parent? What are you seeing that is making you worried? And parents will frequently say, I'm really worried about their future success. We are such a success-driven society that seems to be the only marker for how a child is doing.
Right.
Are they making the mark? Are they doing well in school? Are they meeting milestones that are, let's be honest, created by a neuronorm society that they are acceptable or not acceptable? And I'll always get pushback on that one, because it's, well, in the future they have to be able to be part of a society. And that defensiveness creeps in about how they have to be in society. And I always find that fascinating, because there are plenty of different people in society. And in fact, some of us who have really changed the world, if you look at the people who have, Steve Jobs was definitely not neurotypical. And if it wasn't for him, you all wouldn't be enjoying that phone you love so much. So it's interesting to note that we're so really truly obsessed with fitting in a diagram of what should be future success, and I want to challenge that.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of different ways to show that success, and it doesn't have to be traditional.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I love the point that you just made, that there's no wrong, right? There's no wrong way. And I'm also thinking your example of Steve Jobs, right? On the other end of that, it's like, I've been hearing that autistic individuals are like, okay, but also I don't have to be Superman to, to just be me, that it's okay to just, this is my normal, this is how I am. I don't have to be either, struggling with everything in life, or like the best at whatever and have this really niche quality. You know what I mean?
Right. There doesn't have to be.
Right.
Well, and again, I gave that example because the
Yeah.
success idea is so challenging
right.
for people. But there is also now, I see a shift even in the workforce. If you look at the complaints about, well, no one wants to work anymore. And it's, no, our youth is intelligent enough to see that corporations are taking advantage. That 1% makes billions of dollars, and the rest of us struggle for the day-to-day feeding of ourselves.
Yeah,
and it's
the work
showing
from
up
home, too.
really, really strongly
Yeah.
right now in our economy.
Yeah.
And so there is this real shift, and I do have such hope for this generation that's coming up, that they are going to challenge that whole dynamic, that it doesn't get to be 1% controls all of the income and money in our society, and dribbles it out to us. We get to choose it a little differently.
Yeah.
And that can be a flexible schedule. It doesn't mean a 9-to-5 job.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's understanding that an autistic person may have challenges with time, may have difficulty working, repeatedly for 7 hours at a stretch. Then it might be something where they work a 4-hour day, but in that 4 hours, their productivity is so much higher that it doesn't have to be 8 hours. If you look at a traditional work environment, there's a lot of wasted time. People chit-chatting in the hallway, meetings. Oh, don't even get me started on meetings for an autistic person. They are ridiculous. There's so much minutia and so much jockeying to look good. And if you look at the core of a corporate meeting, 45 minutes of it is productive work, and 2 hours of it is generally, silliness. It doesn't do anything. And an autistic person in 5 minutes will walk out the door because that's another marker.
Yeah.
Like I keep giving you kind of cues into it. It's such a complex understanding, autism.
Yeah.
That I don't think we all understand it very well.
No, right, and it would be impossible for us
to even
discuss
cover all of it.
Right.
I mean, some of the things I will say, there's a very big difference between how autism presents for female identifying people.
Yeah, I want to hear about that. Yeah, how
And
does
I'll go into that a little bit.
Yeah.
So, women are socialized from a very early age to be people pleasers.
Yes.
And to engage well and to make everyone happy. And I would say, I don't care if we think in 1970 we had a big change and all of a sudden women were liberated. It's not true. We're still expected to perform. And so autistic women learn to mask from age 1 when they're, supposed to be cute and funny and sweet and adorable. And so it does not show up until much later when they're in a conversation and people are like, huh? What? Why are you being so blunt? Why are you not asking about my day? Like people get in themselves about that behavior not being correct.
Yeah.
And so I do believe a lot of women have gone undiagnosed. And what's sad about that is instead of being diagnosed with autism, they're being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. They're being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder on the other extreme end of the spectrum. So these are much more, if you look at society's view of mental health, much more disabling conditions that are also medicated poorly and treated poorly and also poorly defined. And so it creates a real dynamic that can cause a lot of harm.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that you answered that wonderfully, and you touched on several things. There's so many things I want to pick apart.
This is a lot. It's a lot to get into.
I know.
It's not a monolith. It's not
many
it's not
things.
Stereotypical behaviors that we think are autistic behavior. It's a lot.
I know, because so okay, I want to go into several things. I'd like to start by doing some definitions, because talking about some definitions for our audience who, maybe you've heard of this, maybe not so much. We talked about masking, autistic burnout. You and I have spoken about that in the past. The trauma response, role of stigma. So there's so many things. And maybe we'll start with the term high functioning.
Ooh, let's
versus
do that.
low functioning.
Yes.
Let's start with that.
So those terms, again, are designed to put people into boxes of, are you meeting success markers designed by society?
Right.
And so high functioning in Japan might be very different than high functioning in America. And so we're looking at, people love to quickly say, my child's autistic, but they're the high functioning kind. Like it's better than the low functioning kind.
Yes, and it's the but too.
And it's a but. It's a big but. It's a very, I don't want anything to be wrong with my child. There's nothing wrong with even a child who needs lots of supports and is an autistic person. Are the needs higher? Yes. Do they, and even there, this is a piece that I'm kind of jumping around, but there's even a lot of things in terms of their physical body too.
Yeah.
We could go on and on, but there is difficulties with digestion. There are issues that come up with eating, ARFID, for example, where literally the texture of food is so difficult that they can't eat.
Right.
So there is some markers of autism that are really clear. Their high sensitivity to their environment. And I will say this, when we talk about that eye contact and we talk about empathy, it was believed that autistic people, because they present as so flat sometimes in the affect, that they're not empathetic, that they can't relate well to others.
The theory of mind is not there.
Exactly. And it's the opposite. They're so highly sensitive to their environment that it causes this kind of shutdown and distance from it. So that's the lack of eye contact you're seeing, the bluntness, the not interacting with the social cues. All of that comes from a space of being so highly sensitive. And that causes a lot for a lot of people. That is the challenge of autism, is that high sensitivity.
Right.
And it affects everything from their body to to their interactions with other people.
Right. So what do we say instead?
So what do we say instead is, and this is the interesting part, when a parent says that quickly, but high functioning, I say, let's, instead of talking those terms, tell me about your child. What are their needs? And breaking it down to what supports do they need to be functioning for themselves, not functioning for whatever reasons that other people come up with, but what makes them comfortable. So we've talked about a non-speaking person. They still communicate. They still are part of a system of verbal communication. They just text it. Or use devices to assist in that communication. That doesn't mean that they're less intelligent, and this is another word that gets dicey for me, because how do we measure that? It doesn't mean that they're not as engaged in our society as someone who is highly verbal.
Sure.
But highly verbal, remember, is prized. Being extroverted, prized. And so the higher functioning really is what we value. And sometimes those values are really skewed. It's great for people to be highly verbal, but how much do we really gain from lots of people talking all the time?
Right.
Half the time the information is very not needed.
Right. And even if, so I'm thinking from my speech therapy perspective, even if a child has or adult, whoever has difficulty speaking out loud, there are, like you mentioned, there are systems, we can call them AAC, alternative and augmentative communication, different means to communicate, texting, anything, and even just, so I always like to think nonverbal means no language, right?
Correct.
Versus non-speaking means I'm just not speaking, right?
Yeah,
so
you put it perfectly.
Yeah, there's a huge difference.
Huge difference. And that's why I'm very specific. And the language, I feel in the neurodiversity movement, the language is very key. And people get worried when I say, no. Like, I'm not trying to put you down. I'm not trying to tell you you're wrong. It's just listen to the language you're using and how you're defining your child. If you're sitting there saying they're highly functioning, you're already putting them in a box of who they are as a person,
Right.
instead of my child is really gifted with shapes and loves
Yeah.
movement and is a wonderful artist, or
Yeah.
come up with more context for who they
Yeah.
are as a person,
Sure.
rather than these labels.
And even like a strengths-based approach too. We can talk
100%.
about, because every single person in the world has strengths and
Weaknesses.
challenge areas,
Yeah,
right? Everybody does. So that's kind of how I, in practice, like to think, okay, we talk about the strengths, this is really good. Now how can we use those strengths to build support?
100%.
Yeah.
And that's my daily work
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
Is even for people who feel like it's insurmountable, oh, there's no way, I can't overcome that. It's really looking at all their adaptivity. And it's fascinating how sometimes people's things that they believe them to be flaws are actually their greatest strengths. Once you start to flip that and say, no, look at how that really helped you. Look at how that changed this for you. And I think that's strength-based model for me is everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not to be Pollyanna about it either, not to dismiss, there's that fine line too, not to dismiss the challenges that come up that we discussed. I mean, so there's a bunch of other things that can occur when you're dealing with autism. And one of them is, the negative way of putting it is pervasive demand avoidance is
Okay.
what the clinical term would
Yeah.
be.
So what is that? Yeah.
And I want to reframe it first,
Yes,
and then I'll explain
absolutely.
it. How I like to call it is actually a pervasive need for autonomy.
Yes. Okay.
A very persistent need for autonomy. So I look at it from a very different diagram. Again, in a strengths
Absolutely.
way, they're looking for their own way of being and have to fight for it because they're going against the norms. When other people look at it as they're being defiant.
Yeah. Yeah.
And kids will actually be diagnosed with things like oppositional defiant
Yes.
disorder
Right.
when they truly are just persisting in their demands for their own autonomy.
Yeah. They control over
Control.
your own body and yeah.
Exactly. And so there is now a huge shift into that.
Yeah.
And I'll even talk about them.
Yeah.
The PDA North America organization is amazing, and there's so much information for parents to help support this understanding of, how do I help my child who's being outwardly, quote unquote, defiant? Shifting that into, how can I support that? How can I help them?
Right.
And so there's a lot of challenges that do come up for people, and that being one of them.
Yeah. No. Perfectly said. I think that's really important knowledge. And I'm thinking. So we talked about high functioning, how that language.
Yep.
We're trying to shift that. We're trying to shift
Supports
autonomy,
needing,
supports,
autonomy.
Exactly. So I'm
Goals.
Yeah, exactly. And
What their
that's
personal goals of and
Absolutely.
even a child
yeah.
can participate,
And they should, right?
and they should.
Yeah, absolutely. And when they're really, really tiny, it might start with parents, or
right.
caregivers. What's important to them. This is important to my family, my culture, my beliefs, my values. Everything needs to be aligned, right? And I think as a child grows, then they start to, everybody's different. They might, maybe they have a lot of their family's same beliefs and values, but then they're like, hey, this is important to me, and they need to be part of that conversation. In whatever type of, whether it's mental health therapy, speech therapy, whatever type of therapy they're in. So I think that's a really, really good point. That, yeah.
And autistic kids really need lots of explanations. So where a neuronormed, and I will use the term, again, I realize I'm not being descriptive enough. A neuronormed person is a person who fits into the ideals of society. They're extroverted. They love communication. They like talking about the minutia of the day. How's the day going? Look at the weather. They can have a 10-minute conversation just on niceties and not feel frustrated, where an autistic person within 2 minutes will be like, can we talk about something really important?
Yeah.
so when I talk neuronorm, those are people that they just naturally fit into this, creation we have of how you behave.
Right.
And so it's interesting how you can see it so easily, even in 2-year-olds, and how they play and how they interact. So it's teaching parents that their child's not wrong or bad because they don't, their parallel play is much more focused on what they want to do rather than engaging in a back and forth type of play situation. So a good example of little children, how they interact.
Yeah, and you know what? I just had a thought while you were describing that. I think in terms of autonomy, being in charge of your own goals, you know, we talked about, okay, when you're older, maybe you can start to voice that. But you make a really good point, because even younger kids, we can observe, and that's what I like to say. Observe, what are they interested in? We can watch, parents can watch and go, oh, you really like to play with this. This is how you like to play with this. Let me join in.
Right.
I'm going to join in, and we're going to build this connection, even though maybe this isn't what I had in mind for my type of play. My child is loving this. Let's have fun together.
Right.
So it's child-led, child-directed play.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also their level of need of engagement.
Right.
Autistic people generally are introverts. And again, I say generally because there is no monolith, right? So there's no one way of being. But the things that I'm describing are just more typical things that come up for autistic individuals. But again, could you be an extrovert and be autistic? Yeah. Would you still be hyper-focused on your needs and your goals and what you want to do? Are you still pretty blunt in your communication? Or there's like a this list that comes up for me when I think of somebody who falls into that description.
Yeah.
But I don't assign a value as one being better than the other. And I think that's the difference.
That's the big movement.
That's the big movement.
Right. No.
Away from autism speaks and the cure, and there is no cure for who you are.
Yeah, no, right.
And nor should we want that.
Yeah. And I want to, right there, I want to ask you about identity first versus, you know, person with autism, right?
Right.
So why is this shift happening? And I also want to touch on how we're hearing sometimes parents will prefer to say my child with autism, right? So where does that all, that's a big question.
It's a big question. And one of the first things I will say is a person, so if we're talking about, you know, somebody verbal, older, speaking about their own identity, they get to choose.
Yep.
So if you are a person, you know, you get to decide. It's always your decision. But I think parents, it's this comfort level. Yeah. Again, you say the word autism to a parent, they freak out. Yeah. It is terrifying because we created a medical model of disability that did not affirm who these children were. Yeah. It was fix it. Yeah. Make it go away. Make my life easier. Because if they're normed, then everything's simple. Yeah. They just follow in. There's no challenge. There's no difficulty. You just get to go about the day. Yeah. And so I think there is this very big fear if I say my autistic child, oh, this is lifelong and permanent. Oh, no. Instead of, oh, this is lifelong and permanent. Yay, that's who you are.
Yeah, sure.
And an acceptance. So that's that shift in language that's so important. Yeah. But I caution, if somebody says to me, I'm a person with autism, oh, I accept that.
Right, absolutely.
It's automatically.
It's not
because it's
your place,
it's your decision how you identify yourself. Absolutely. Again, that autonomy situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for parents, I do think it's this, I have a highly functioning kiddo, or my child's on the spectrum. I mean, I think that's become like kind of the lexicon of, I have an autistic child is on the spectrum. And I'm okay with on the spectrum because it is a spectrum of challenges and strengths and behaviors, and as long as it's not using to make one better than the other.
Okay.
I'm in a constant state of reminding us no individual human being is better than another. Yeah, right. And we really need to stop with that.
Yeah, okay.
The comparisons. Yeah. And parents are so fraught with that. Yeah. Because look what happens at school. your child comes home with a grade report, even in kindergarten, and they've, softened it a bit. They've taken away grades and, before 5th grade, but it's still on grade level, not meeting expectations. There's still negative language there when a child is not doing something according to a norm that is created. None of these things are real. They're developed and created, and they're not facts. Yet we hang our hats on them. And we get very upset when our children aren't meeting them. And that's really hard. That's hard to be a parent at a preschool where every kid is, doing things a certain way, and your child's off doing something different.
And it's hard not to compare.
It's hard. And again, we're by nature, I think human beings do that compare and contrast. And they do, we live in a society that's very competitive.
Yes, for sure.
And so that competition, I think, breeds this need to cure what is not falling in line with the norms.
And I'm thinking as you speak, like, competition and the idea that people can be very judgmental too. So that's a huge,
huge piece of this.
So it's like, and so I'm
talk
wondering
about that in a second.
I'm wondering about the stigma piece, and I would love to bring that into masking as well. What does that mean? So 2 parts. So Tara Vance is an amazing, and I will throw in some experts that people can research. And I highly, highly recommend their website, Neuroclastic. And it sounds like it's spelled. Neuroclastic, I think it's .com or .org. But Tara Vance is one of the main writers on there. And they have a whole infographic that I use constantly on thin slice judgment. So there was a study done. Again, I have ADHD, which we'll explain a little bit more about. So details always escape me, but I get the big picture of things. So there was a study done on thin slice judgments. And what they've noted is within 30 seconds, people will make their mind up about an autistic person and categorize their non-normed behaviors as weird, different, odd, 30 seconds,
strange. 30 seconds for a thin slice judgment to occur. So Tara created this amazing infographic that goes over how that happens for autistic people. And when we get into trauma, that's where the trauma happens. That turn away, that look, and remember, we're talking about a person who's incredibly sensitive to their environment. And suddenly the rejection is real. Even if it's not happening, because it happens so frequently, they will assume any look or even just a turn down of your mouth is a sign that you are judging them, because so frequently they are being judged. And so and that happens like that thin slice. And so it is really important for us to note that how we treat people and how we perceive them really does affect them every day. And it's hard. And so parents fall into that too. They don't want to be the parent of the child having this thin slice judgment put upon them. So I'm going to soften my language. I'm going to distance from it. I'm not going to say they have autism.
To protect.
It's very protective.
And that's such a hard thing, because it's like, of course you want to protect your child, but at the same time it's like, it is such a hard thing, because it's like we need to change all of society first.
We just need to. And I'll frequently hear that too.
No big deal.
I have to hear that too, is, society is the way it is, and I have to toughen my child up.
I know,
Guess what? Society's going to toughen them up enough. Home needs to be the accepting, safe environment. Imagine yourself, you're out at work all day, your boss yells at you for something you didn't do, and the person down the hall did, and you're going through a tough day, and you come home, and now your spouse is telling you, you need to become a better employee, or you need to work harder and fit in better. Are you going to be able to get through? No, you're going to feel demoralized. And so we need to recognize that they're dealing with those thin slice judgments. They're going to be out there. And so we have to be, as parents, the affirming soft landing. And they're going to come home and they're going to act out in that space. Because the masking that you ask about is the pretending. And I'll talk about my own experience a little bit here.
Please
so
do.
people look at me now and would never think that, well, maybe the ADHD, because I talk really quickly, they would pick up on that fast, but would never think that I also view myself as someone who, while not formally diagnosed, definitely has autism to some degree.
Sure.
I spent my early years in grammar school looking at other children for social cues on how to behave. I felt like there was a secret society that tells kids, and I really made this whole thing up, that tells kids how to do things so that they could make friends. And then I didn't get the information.
Yeah.
Someone was holding it back from
Yeah.
me. And maybe their parents told them, and my mom just didn't want me to know. It was a whole conspiracy theory I created that explained why these girls in my class were all like fast friends, and I struggled to make those connections. And so I became the observer, and then I did what they did.
Yep.
So I noticed in middle school that girls, in order to connect, would complain. And so I thought this was fascinating.
Not middle school girls.
Middle school girls would complain about their looks, or they would say, I hate my hair, it's so ugly.
Right.
And so I adopted this very negative, actually, way of being, because that's how girls communicate. And it's fascinating looking back now how, I was perceived as negative, but I thought, well, that's how girls connect, so I have to do this negative behavior.
Right.
So that's masking. That's taking on a persona of what you're seeing in your environment. They're getting the raise, so I'm going to do what they do to get a raise, even though it's completely out of your character and not who you are.
Sure.
And kissing up to the boss is certainly not in an autistic adult's way of being. A blunt criticism about how the company's being run, probably much more in line. So it's having to pretend to be neuronormed in a society that prizes extroverts, prizes social conversation, prizes being in a meeting for 2 hours where everybody gets to show off their expertise and intelligence and how great they are. That is exhausting for an autistic person.
Yes, and so I'm hearing you, and I know you know where we're going with this, but I'm thinking, okay, let's talk about the trauma response and
Great.
autistic burnout.
Yep.